Welcome to the BAFA Accounting History Special Interest Group 9th Virtual Workshop on Tuesday, 17th of January 2023.
A very warm welcome. A happy new year to you all. It's lovely to see you all again, even if it's by link rather than in person. For those of you who perhaps haven't met me so far, my name's Alistair Doby. I'm one of the members of the BAFA Special Interest Group in Accounting History. Could I also introduce Karen, who has been keeping things going, or is keeping things going, I should say, who is the chair of the Accounting History Special Interest Group.
Hi everyone, welcome.
This morning we've got three speakers. Unfortunately, you'll have to endure me to start with, as the person I had been hoping would come along hasn't been able to be here, unfortunately. But then we've got two very interesting speakers after that. Catherine Casson from the University of Manchester Alliance Business School, who will be talking on property markets, and Jordan Claridge, who does work in a variety of areas, including, I think, dairies, horsepower, but will be speaking about medieval wages. And I think those will be but two very interesting presentations for us, because they both use accounting historians, but they're both by people who aren't so much in what we think of as the accounting history discipline, they're more in economic history. So lots of interesting things to come. I'm going to start off first. The normal format will be approximately 25 minutes for the presentation and then 10 minutes for questions and discussion. This is a paper I started working on, I'm afraid, a few years ago, and then it's just got abandoned with other things going on. And the title of it is Accounting as a Biographical Tool, a Re-Evaluation of the Career of Geoffrey of Burden, who was a prior of Durham Cathedral Priory in the period 1313 to 21. And why I got interested in this topic area is there is one short sort of biographical paper on Geoffrey of Burden, and it's rather condemning in terms of his period of office, and accuses him of financial mismanagement, and basically helping himself to the income of the priory as well. And I thought I would go back and actually have a look at some of the account rolls and see if those negative conclusions were justified or not. And you'll probably not be surprised to say that, or to hear that I have reassessed those earlier conclusions. Right. Okay, sorry, my computer's a little bit slow at the moment, so yeah, I have moved forward onto the next slide. So the paper structure, I'm going to talk a little bit about Durham Cathedral Priory at the start, what it was and the resources that it controls. Then I'm going to look at some of the earlier conclusions of Geoffrey of Burden, and I think you'll agree there's certainly a bit of controversy about what he was up to during his priorate. Then I'll look at, in more detail, at the allegations of financial mismanagement, and finally come to a reassessment of Geoffrey of Burden as a prior of Durham. So, excuse me, I just thought I'd start off by showing you some pictures of Durham Cathedral and of the Priory buildings, just to give you an idea of the scale of sort of institution that was involved in Durham Cathedral Priory in the Middle Ages. This is a view of the main tower over the central crossing of Durham Cathedral, taken from the cloister, and the accounting records are still kept at the back of the cathedral. There's an area, a nice grassy green called the College, and the archives are still there. And I must say, it does give you quite a thrill in that you can look at an account written by a bursar such as John of Crepping in 1313, and then for your lunch you can walk through the same gateway that he walked through I think the refectory's changed a bit since his day, but it certainly does give you quite a buzz of excitement. So that's the picture of the cathedral. You can see the Romanesque arches of the nave there, and just the scale gives you an idea of the resources involved. A prior might not sound very important. We tend to think of as bishops as being important, and certainly abbots. But in a cathedral priory such as Durham, the bishop tended not to be involved very much in the priory at all, and the priory was actually a self-governing organisation. So the prior was, in fact, on a par with other abbots in medieval England. Okay, so Durham Cathedral Priory, it was a monastic house. It was governed by the rule of St. Benedict, and it was a Norman refoundation in 1083 of an ancient Northumbrian house, which dates back to the time of St. Cuthbert. And the power of St. Cuthbert is probably one of the key assets. If you think of the accounting definition of an asset, something controlled by an organization from which future economic benefits are expected to flow, as we'll see, having the heritage of St. Cuthbert, and in particular having the body of St. Cuthbert, was a source of great power and of income to the monks of Durham Cathedral Priory. So medieval monasticism, a withdrawal from the world, dedicating one's life to God, taking the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. There was great belief in the power of prayer in those days. If you could endow a chapel or something and you could get the monks praying for you, then it was felt that they really did have a positive impact. At Durham was kept the banner of St. Cuthbert, and English kings regularly used to come and take the banner of St. Cuthbert and take it into battle with them to try and bring themselves success. So a lot of prayer, but they're also centres of hospitality, of learning and charity. And I suppose throughout time, as we've evaluated these monastic institutions, there have been contrary views. One has seen them as sort of being beacons of spiritual life and charity. On the other hand, they've been criticized for being corrupt and redundant institutions. And when you look at medieval monasticism, you tend to see there's an ongoing pattern of periods of vigor and vitality interspersed with periods of lethargy and decay. And throughout the Middle Ages, it wasn't just the big Protestant reform movement of the 16th century. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were lots of mini reforms to try and get back to the original instructions of St. Benedict in the rule which he devised for monks. So the Rule of St. Benedict is a rule book for the administration of a monastic community. One of the people here today, Francis, you probably very kindly muted at the moment, but you said you were looking forward to some Latin here. So here are some Latin quotations from the rule. They're concerned with the role and the responsibilities of the leader of the house, be it an abbot or a prior. And the first things, but the abbot or the prior should recognize that for all his judgments, for all his decisions, and for all his works, he will have to render account to God. Okay, and in the second one it says the prior or the abbot should take every care in terms of looking after the infirm or the ill, of children, of guests, and of the poor. And he should take every care whilst looking after them, knowing without doubt that for all the things he does on the day of judgment, he will have to render account. And I've just put at the bottom there, they both have that similar wording, rationem redituris est, he will have to render an account. And that can be seen to show that accounting was at the heart of your responsibilities as head of a medieval house. So Durham Cathedral Priory, it was founded in 1083 by Bishop William of Calais. Monks were drawn from the refounded and reformed monasteries of Jarrow and Wearmouth. It succeeded a community of culdees. These were it was a hereditary office really, and it was a form of clergy, but they were married, which obviously, went completely out of fashion. 11th, 12th century onwards, the church was very concerned that priests shouldn't be able to marry and pass their offices onto their children. Foundation very, very much concerned with St. Cuthbert. A monastery had been founded in 635 AD in Lindisfarne, following invitation of King Oswald of Northumbria. Cuthbert moved from Melrose to Lindisfarne, becoming abbot and then bishop, and he died in 687, already known for his sanctity. In 698, on opening his coffin, his body was found to be incorrupt, so it was well preserved, and this was considered a strong indication of sanctity. Incorruptibility was correlated to purity of life. Okay, and following that, you get pilgrims going to the shrine. There are all sorts of records of miracles. Everything from boils to blindness were apparently cured there. 3 accounts of his life were written within 50 years of his death. Obviously, these circulated and helped to grow his cult. Viking attacks occurred, and the body of St. Cuthbert didn't have a peaceful time. The monks travelled all the way around northern England with it, stopping in various places. I'm based in Lancashire on the west coast, in a place called Lytham St Anne's, and there is actually a stone outside a park in Lytham declaring that this was one of the resting places for St Cuthbert's body. Anyway, eventually he got back to the northeast when things were a little quieter. Attracted a lot of royal attention, visits by King Athelstan, King Edmund, King Canute, etc. His tomb was associated with miraculous cures. His banner, as I've already said, was frequently taken north by English kings. There is also a nice story of William the Conqueror, who came north in part of his harrowing of the north, which, he went on, he got up into Scotland and Fife as well. And he asked to see the body, and the monks were horrified at this. But apparently St. Cuthbert gave him a very, very bad dose of stomach ache and stomach pains, and apparently William the Conqueror fled without trying to insist that the coffin was open. So St. Cuthbert, a big draw for pilgrims. People gave lands to the monastery as well as monetary offerings. Durham Cathedral Priory was a Benedictine cathedral priory, so it was served by monks rather than by secular priests. This is quite unusual compared to most of the rest of Western Europe. There are 1 or 2 examples, I think in Sicily, Monreale, which again, Norman influence there, has Benedictine monks as well, but normally it would be canons. But in England, we have quite a few of Benedictine cathedral priories, others being found at Canterbury, Norwich, Rochester, Winchester, and Worcester. Okay. They were a religious community. The titular abbot was the bishop, but in effect, the community became independent, and its possessions and the way they were administered were completely distinct from those of the bishop. Just to give you an idea of the scale of possessions involved, the Priory owned extensive lands in Scotland, in Berwickshire, throughout Northumberland, County Durham, Yorkshire, Lancashire. Lytham was one of their subsidiary houses in Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, Oxford, and London. Thousands of individual dues in a multiplicity of forms, so they're entitled to money rents, rents in eggs, hens, services in the fields, tithes, the income from appropriated churches. So there are lots and lots of income streams there, as well as the pilgrims. I think at one period I counted they had something like 800 different tenants paying them income, and often they'd be paying these income both in money and in kind. As well as this, they had the yields of their directly managed domain, so the lands which they didn't rent out, but which they exploited themselves. So they're using labour due from people who rented land from them. So they also got a lot of income in terms of corn, animal products as well, but also coal, timber. They even had their own little iron foundry as well. Body of St Cuthbert, obviously a very big draw. And the final split of resources of the Priory from those of the bishop were defined in a document called Le Convenit of 1229. Number of monks varied over the life of the house. The house extended until its dissolution in 1539. Number of monks ranged between 50 and 120. 1274, for example, they had 113 monks. Because it was a big organization, they had quite a sophisticated way of running the organization, which could loosely be referred to as the obedientiary system. At the top, you've got the prior with his deputy, the sub-prior, and then you have a whole range of officers underneath, all filled by monks responsible for different functions. So the bursar, for example, was responsible for cash income, cash outflows, monitoring the cash. The terrar was responsible for agreeing rents for lands. The granitor received and issued grains from the manors. The cellarer dealt with other foodstuffs. The feretrar dealt with the shrine of St Cuthbert. The sacrist looked after the cleaning of the church, candles, etc. The precentor, succenter looked after services. Then you've got the almoner providing alms to the poor, the chamberlain responsible for clothing, and people concerned with looking after the ill and guests as well. So a lot of different offices there, and the interesting thing, most of these offices rendered accounts. I haven't found anything from people who were, say, in charge of the singing in the cathedral, but any office that involves the receipt or expenditure of money, accounts survive from it. The cathedral itself is obviously a big place. You've got the cathedral, you've got the cloister, the chapter house, refectory, guest house, brew houses, bakers, kitchens, etc. Those are all based in Durham. Then you have the cells, the sort of subsidiary priories, and there's a range of these. There's one in Coldingham in Berwickshire. Then you've got one on the island of Farne, one on Lindisfarne, one at Finkel. A house for student monks in Oxford. Large number of manors are owned, just two examples, Bear Park and Muggleswick, and then you've got the appropriated churches as well. And here are just a few pictures to show you what the monastery looks like. This is Finkel, rather lovely. This is where the monks went for rest and relaxation. If you ever get the chance to go to Newcastle University Library, please do. Go into the basement, you see these beautiful bowls, and then it's with a sense of horror that you read these are actually bleeding bowls. And bleeding was done very regularly for the monks, and I sometimes wonder whether it was sort of to control their libidos and egos, etc. But after they'd been bled, they would be sent here for a special diet of meat and some rest and relaxation. So Finkel's quite a lot. This is just an example of a manor. That's all that's left, manor of Bear Park. Muggleswick up in the hills, which was a sheep rearing centre. One of the appropriated churches, again, you can see the money that was spent on the architecture there, wall paintings. Okay, so that was just to give you an overview of Durham Cathedral Priory. Geoffrey of Burden was certainly a controversial prior. Sources, we've got the account rolls, we've got visitation records, inspections by outside bodies. There's the paper by Scaml, which I'm critiquing. Geoffrey of Burden was professed as a monk around 1283. He had a range of offices. He was prior of certain of the subsidiary houses before he became prior of the main house, 1313 to 21. He retired in 1321, as a lot of priors did, and was still alive in 1333. This gives you an example of the controversy. He was excommunicated by the Bishop of Durham twice. He was arrested for breaking into Durham Cathedral, theft of money and records. It's alleged he kept a woman in the dormitory and in a cellar at Oxford. It's alleged that he stole goods from Finkel Priory. We certainly know he did travel a lot. He went to York, London, Worcester and Rome on Priory business. Eventually, he was sentenced to 10 years isolation by the Bishop of Durham, but this was annulled by the Archbishop of York on appeal. And Scaml says that there is evidence of financial mismanagement and the diversion of income to his own pockets. But what we have to remember is there was a huge dispute between the Priory and the Bishop, and the Geoffrey of Burden was on the side of the sort of independence of the Priory sect rather than the Bishop's own sect. So the Bishop tried to get too involved in the Priory, life of the Priory. The monks weren't having it. The Bishop blockaded the Priory, broke down the doors of the cathedral, dragged the prior out, tried to appoint a replacement, but after appeals to the Archbishop, King, and the Pope, the original prior was restored to office. And this bishop, Bishop Beck, I mean, he was quite a bigwig. He was also Patriarch of Jerusalem at the time, so he's quite an important person. Anyway, one of the key things that Scaml says, Scaml does a comparison of the account rolls of 1318 to 19 during Geoffrey of Burden's priorate, and 1330 to 1, which is subsequent to the priorate of Geoffrey, and claims that the 1318-19 income of 1339 is artificially depressed by the prior helping himself to things he shouldn't have been helping himself, compared to a more normal level of £2,200 in a subsequent priorate. I won't go into this, is just to give you some pictures of some of the records here, just so you can see. This is a status of Holy Island from 1326, so we're talking about the time of Geoffrey of Burden, and it just gives you an idea of the detail and the meticulous way in which accounting records were kept. Okay, I could talk on all of these. I dug out the accounts for these 2 years. Scaml says under Geoffrey of Burden, the income was only 1339, but it was, £1,000 higher almost during the priorate of the successor. Okay, but what you have to do is actually look at more than the totals. You have to see what makes up those totals. And just to give you some examples of the differences I found, which would explain this apparently low income of 1318-19, is that the arrears brought forward, so that's rents which hadn't been received but were due to be received, okay, were only £17 under Geoffrey of Burden. Under the successor, there's a huge amount more there, £1,375. Under Geoffrey of Burden, income is only boosted by £21 of borrowing, compared to £623 in the later account. And from Scotland, Geoffrey of Burden didn't get anything because of the Anglo-Scottish Wars and what was happening there, compared to £330, which was received once peace had been agreed between Scotland and England. So when you look at the accounts in detail, you can't just say that the income was a lot lower under Geoffrey of Burden and that was either mismanagement or him taking money for his own uses. You might think, oh, well, these sound particularly small sums of money, but the average earldom in 14th century England would have been around about £2,000. So it was quite a significant income we're talking about. We also have to remember that during Geoffrey's priorate, it was a very difficult economic background. The cost of the dispute with the bishop and the journeys to Rome and petitions to Rome cost thousands of pounds. At the time also, there was murrain. The Chronicle says that there was a pestilence amongst cattle of a kind not seen before. There was harvest failure. Again, the Chronicle says there was a sterility in yields, so much so that a quarter of wheat sold for 40 shillings, well, often it would sell for perhaps a tenth of that price. The period was also marked by huge floods on a scale that no one could remember. There were the Anglo-Scottish Wars. One time the prior, I showed you a picture of Bear Park. He was in his little manor house outside Durham, and he had to scurry back because the Scottish army was there. This was after the Battle of Bannockburn, where Edward II had been defeated. All these things led to famine, and the Chronicle again says that women were so hungry that they were eating their own children on account of the greatness of their hunger. And the Chronicle as well says, people died in fields, on roads and paths, in towns and outside, so that scarcely anyone was left to bury them, and gives us a figure of 20,000 dying alone in London.
Alistair, you're just about up to time.
Okay, we'll just take another minute. Scaml also looks at the accounts and says where there should be income from manors, there is just an entry which says nihil qui est in manu prioris, nothing because it is in the hands of the prior, and concludes that means the prior was taking income from the manors. In fact, that's an expression which means that the manor, rather than being rented out, is being directly managed by the house, and you can actually see income rather than money rental income. You can see grain coming into the granitors' accounts from these manors. Okay. Finally, Scaml alleges that Burden arranged an over-generous retirement provision. However, I've done some comparisons with other priors, and it doesn't appear overly generous to me at all. For example, when Geoffrey of Burden retired, he was given a little priory of Wearmouth to dwell in and its revenues, exactly the same as a predecessor, Prior Richard of Claxton, was in 1273 to 85. So I couldn't resist this quotation. Where there are many heads, there are many opinions. It's difficult to find one that pleases everybody, and that's a bit like the opinions on Geoffrey of Burden. Did he retire, or was he sort of sacked on the quiet? He was accused of many things, but he had a worthy defence. Okay, and it's argued by the chronicler that he preferred to surrender his office rather than expend the goods of the house on expensive litigation. What I can say, the allegations of financial irregularity don't seem to be justified, and drops in income were because it was a particularly difficult period. So that's the end of my presentation there. I can never resist putting this in. I just found this by chance reading an Everyman medieval miracle play. If his reckoning be not clear when he doth come, God will say, go, O cursed one, into the eternal fire, and he that hath his account whole and sound, high in heaven he shall be crowned. So I think priors were very concerned about accountability, and they kept accounts, and I can't find the evidence for justifying an accusation of financial mismanagement. Okay, I shall shut up now, Karen, which is always difficult for me, as you know.
That's fabulous. Really, really good. Well
so sorry it was a bit of a whistle tour, and as I say, I'm sort of revising things I'd started thinking about, about 3 years ago, and then got abandoned. But if anyone's any thoughts or questions or suggestions, I'd be very grateful to hear them.
Please do chip in if you have any questions, or raise a hand if you prefer to do it that way. Richard.
You do your justification against the argument that compares 1 year with a much later period. Normally, wouldn't you, in an audit, you'd compare the previous year and the subsequent year to see if there was any particular irregularity in, 13, 18, 19? have we got the numbers for 13, 17, 18, and
Yeah, ideally, would Richard, but we've got a gap in the account, so those are the two closest ones we have.
Destroyed by the prior, yeah.
Well, that's one thought, yes. But what we can do is we can do comparisons, because we've got lots of accounts before that, earlier and later, and we can see that there's a lot of stability in levels of revenue. So it doesn't look as though there's a huge mismatch between what I'm saying. Obviously, I'd love to have the record for the year before or after, but we just don't. But for things like rental incomes, we can agree those later on, and rental incomes don't change very much over the period.
Right.
So there does seem to be some consistency, but yeah, I do accept that point.
I think John had his hand raised as well.
Francis has got her hand up.
Oh, Francis.
Somewhere. She's still mute, unfortunately.
Sorry, I was just unmuting and everythinging. Okay, from what I recall from about Geoffrey of Burden, because Durham, I'm an embroiderer, a goldwork medieval embroiderer, and Durham's a big centre of medieval embroidery. So from what I recall about of the prior, before he became the prior of Durham, he was the prior of both Lytham and, is it Finkel?
Finkel,
And then, yeah, that's it. And then they were separate priories, and he was prior, had a turn of prior of both. And then he became the prior of Durham, which was effectively a promotion, and then they became cells under Durham at that time, or round about that time. And the thing about this is that if he'd stuffed finances elsewhere, it's highly unlikely he would have been promoted to prior of Durham, particularly since Benedictines were right into accountability, and still are right into accountability of finance, because it's seen as accountability to God, and of course it's part of the rule of St. Benedict, as you know. So I think that there's also that history about him that while it's not the evidence from the accounts from the other places, does suggest that the church wouldn't have promoted a Benedictine who'd stuffed the finances elsewhere, and he's highly unlikely to have been the world's best manager at two other priories and then suddenly have totally lost the plot at Durham. It just doesn't make sense to me logically.
I think that's a really good point, Francis. Yeah, and the fact that there don't seem to be any, from what we've got, there don't seem to be any problems arising from his periods of governance at Finkel or Lytham, and we certainly do have problems from other priors in those places. For example, a later prior at Lytham, it ends up going with appeals to the Pope and things, trying to dislodge this person for mismanagement. And there's no, I mean, it may not have survived, of course, but there's no evidence of problems elsewhere. And then, as you say, it does seem unlikely, if he was known as someone who didn't run things well, who took a lot of the income from himself, who did deprive the other monks, it seems unlikely that they would have elected him to be prior of the main house.
I think this is also round about the time when the Catholic Church was having a bit of a crackdown on bad priory management. I know that at Cluny they had a big crackdown on that. And of course, then the abbot from Cluny went over to Monte Cassino and made a whole lot of changes there. So it was certainly something that was going on in the church at that time, a concern about getting good managers. I just don't think he had the track record of being a bad manager. But that's more.
Yeah, and no, you're quite right. The church was very concerned. I mean, the bishops always had the right of visitation, and we should really think about inspection as a term rather than visitation, because we think of visits as nice things, don't we? Whereas a visitation was actually, we're going to check all your accounting records, and we're going to speak to each monk individually and ask if they've any complaints, and we're going to
They still use the same term.
Yes, yeah. So as well as the Bishop of Durham, you had the Archbishop of York who visited, and in 1215 you've got the papal decretal for in singulis regnis in every kingdom, saying that Benedictines who aren't part of a formal order like the monasteries of Cluny or Cito are, need to come together every 3 years for the good governance of their order, and they need to to appoint visitors who will go round. And we do have records, not from Geoffrey of Burden's period, but from other periods, and they were quite rigorous in what they said and what they evaluated. There's detailed questioning of what's going on in the accounts there. So, it seems very likely that there were such visitations and they would have picked something up. Obviously, you've got the problem during his priorate, you've got all the Scots coming south of the border and basically being bought off, and we'll give you 5,000 marks if you don't burn our lands and things. So there was some disruption there. But no, I think you're quite right. There was a lot of inspection going on. Thank you.
Other questions? I'm sure I saw somebody else had a question. Just unmute yourself and ask, please.
Yeah, sorry, I can't see everyone. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Just a quick question. I wonder at what point, if at all, was there any sort of independent review or audit introduced to the financial records? Was that ever introduced? Does it exist now? Or
well, in a sense, it wasn't such a separate thing as it's seen as nowadays. The accounts were compiled and then they were read to the person who'd received them, which would always be the prior, but also normally the more important, they used to talk about the wiser portion of the monks. There'd be a little committee, and the accounts would normally be read out to them, and there are examples of saying, well, that shouldn't be £20, and what about this £10 loan or something like that. So it wasn't as though they were being prepared and not audited. It wasn't the same audit in terms of doing extensive audit tests that we'd see nowadays, but there would be people who knew what was going on in the room, and they were certainly very quick to ask any questions. We've got really detailed questions surviving from other readings of the accounts.
Thank you. So just one follow-up question. Were the accounts, do they follow a specific financial year? Were they over a standard 12-month period? Did all of the sort of monasteries and priories, do they all have the same year end?
The year ends do change over the period. Their manors, for example, they tend to have an autumn year end, so it could be Michaelmas or Martinmas, 29th of September or in November, because of getting the grain in and things. The officers, for example, the bursars, the terrar, they accounted regularly on those dates as well, but sometimes it did change from year to year, and it seems to have changed. Sometimes the office holder just died. Sometimes they were appointed to another office. So rather than the office, the accounts for the office of bursar being for a full year, if the office holder changed during the year, the old bursar would present their accounts as up, say, for 6 months or 5 months before the new bursar took over. So there is some variety. I mean, what always impresses me is when the Black Death arrived at Durham, and in a 2-week period, 50% of the monks died. and yet they still managed to produce their accounts for that year. And I just wonder how, you know, many of our organisations get on if we had a 50% death rate, you know, in 2 weeks.
Wow.
Sorry, Karen, I've probably gone on a bit too much into break time there, have I?
We are a little bit into the break time. We've got 1 minute for a quick comfort break if anyone wants it. Otherwise, we're straight over to
Just going to
Jordan.
ask Alistair, going back to the question about audit, was there anybody outside the Priory interested in how much it was making? I mean, did they have to pay a levy to the diocese, or a levy to the Pope, or levy to the King? Was there somebody who would be interested to know just how much money, income they had, so that they could tithe it or whatever the imposition?
Yes, you do get papal and royal impositions of taxation, which might be a 10th of income or a 20th of income or something like that. And there are records kept. So there's something called the Valuation of Norwich, for example, and it was updated, where papal commissioners go round and they get the value of the rents of all the lands and the values of the tithes, so that when the Pope says, I want to impose a 10th, they've got an idea what sort of income the place should be generating. So the answer to that is yes. Durham seems to have got off lightly in terms of royal taxation because it was seen as being on the frontier and suffering quite a bit. It often got some sort of exemption from having to pay royal tax. Not always, but certainly early 14th century.
The bishops of Durham were the prince bishops of Durham, weren't they? Because they were charged with defending the border.
Yes. Yeah.
So military stuff was done by the bishop, presumably.
Yes, there's no evidence of the priory, you know, whereas the bishop would go into battle. There's no evidence of a prior ever going into battle. But some of the lands that they rented out, one of the obligations might possibly be military service, which then presumably that, you know, you'd go to the bishop or whatever to perform it.
Great. Thank you very much, Alistair. Can we thank Alistair in the usual way? That was excellent.
Thank you all
very
much for your
interesting. Thank you.
Anyway.
And would you like to introduce Jordan, Alistair?
Yes, I will. Hello, Jordan. You've disappeared from my screen, but I hope you're still there. Could you unmute, please?
Still here.
That's great. No, I had the pleasure of meeting Jordan for the first time. There was a Royal Statistical Society day on how statistics using medieval data could be put together. And Jordan spoke at that, as did Catherine, in fact. So, Jordan, I'd just like to say a very warm welcome to you. Thank you very much for agreeing, because I think you were away in the US before Christmas, weren't you?
Yeah, back in London now.
You were on sabbatical. Yeah, good. So Jordan lectures in economic history at the London School of Economics. He's particularly interested in the way people, individuals and society, markets and industries respond to changes in economic conditions. He's got a variety of interests. As I said earlier, I think you've looked at the dairy industry, you've looked at horsepower, and you're looking at wages. And today, we're delighted that you're going to be able to offer us some insights into medieval wages.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Alistair. And this is, I mean, really fortuitous that, for me anyway, that you've had to step in here at the last minute, because it's a really natural kind of transition from what you're doing into what we're doing, because we are taking data from manorial accounts, which are the accounts Alistair was talking about of the seigneurial properties owned by medieval lords, many of which were these great ecclesiastical institutions. And actually, we have the Durham Cathedral Priory accounts in our data set. It's not quite worked up yet, so it's not in the figures I'm going to show you today, but it will eventually comprise part of our sample. So what I want to talk to you about today is something actually very specific, and it's about how wages were paid in late medieval England and the implications that has for our wider understanding of long-run economic history. And I mean, basically, economic historians are interested in wages because of this graph in the very long run, right? This is from Greg Clark, and it's a kind of a stylized figure, but what we're seeing here is the trajectory of human wealth over the very long run, and many, many centuries of stagnation, which a lot of people attribute to like a Malthusian system where the relationship between population and the available resources are what are driving economic trajectories. And then obviously we get the kind of hockey stick curve at the end with an industrial revolution and the great divergence where Western Europe becomes rich before the rest of the world. And this is basically, in a nutshell, what economic historians are interested in. And a lot of the evidence that underpins this graph is actually, for the historical period, comes from wages, right? And there's a lot of other things we can delve into and about what wage data has been used for, debates about the standards of living at any time or place, the modern economic growth and the Industrial Revolution and the so-called Industrious Revolution that preceded it, comparative economic development in terms of why Europe grows rich before other parts of the world, and all sorts of other things. They're all dependent on wage data, right? And just to give you an example about how wage data informs some of these theoretical debates, here's a plot. The diamonds are day wages paid to laborers who are working by the day, typically in agriculture or in building. And the circles are GDP per capita, right? So what you can see basically that has confounded economic historians is that this day wage data, which historians have relied on for a long time, doesn't really seem to line up with the most recent estimates of historical GDP. And from these kind of data sets, people have made an array of conclusions. So for example, when wages go really high in the period immediately after the Black Death, so the latter stages of the 14th century, you get this idea of the backward bending labor supply curve where perhaps wages got so high and medieval people actually didn't have a desire to accumulate wealth, and there wasn't actually that many things one could buy. So what they did is it had a preference for leisure, right? Wages go up, and what that means is you work fewer days in a year, you work your 120 days, and then you put your feet up for the rest of the year because that's what your goal is, which is actually kind of antithetical to what we think of now as the motivations for wage earners. And going on, this industrious revolution, which is an idea most strongly argued for by Jan de Vries, is this idea that when we start to get consumer goods more widely available, the preferences of workers change. There's now a desire to consume new things, sugar, tobacco, textiles, and all of a sudden people are willing to work harder and willing to work longer in order to consume those things, and you get kind of a more labor added to the economy. But this is often based upon wage data as well. So it's a very kind of hotly contested historiography, and it goes back into the 19th century at least, right? Of people finding historical wage data back into the Middle Ages and trying to create wage series from which they were trying to understand the broader trajectories of the economy, right? So I won't go into detail about all of these works. Just safe to say, it has a long history, and it's kind of blown up in the last decade or so. Economic historians are once again really, really focused on wages. But the issue is that for the medieval period that we're going to discuss, it's primarily an agricultural economy, right? Like most of the population is engaged in the primary sector. That's where wealth is created, and agricultural wages, especially for those who were employed for longer periods of time, they were paid both in cash and in kind, right? So they get a payment, usually in grain, so could sometimes be gloves or maybe tools or something. So it's not a completely monetary wage. It's partially in cash, but mostly in grain. And it's actually been very difficult for historians to calculate those wages accurately. And this is, basically goes back to a paper I published in 2015 with my colleague John Langdon. We look at, these agricultural laborers with kind of one calculation, and then Jane Humphreys and Jacob Weisdorf, who are more economists and less historians, have developed a new methodology in recent years and have published quite a lot of influential papers on long-run wages. So this is their work. It goes from 1250 to 1850, a period of 500 years. I'm going to talk about the medieval period. We're looking basically from 1250 to 1450, kind of the traditional late medieval period. Now, what I want to say today is that basically the work that has come before in trying to calculate these agricultural wages for the medieval period are seriously flawed. And that includes the work I did in 2015 as well, right? Because in 2015, we didn't really have a way to create a common denominator that would allow us to add the grain payments and the cash payments together, right? You need some kind of common denominator. You either need to convert the grain into cash and add it together, or you could put the cash into grain and see how much grain you could buy with the cash, or you might even use calories as a common denominator, right? The calorific content of the grains, plus the grains you could buy with your cash and how many calories they could create. So there's a number of different ways to do it, but we didn't do it in 2015. The innovation that Jane and Jacob brought to the literature starting in 2015, but right up to the present day, is they used what is commonly called a CPI basket, a consumer price index basket. What they looked at is and assumed is that any grain payment that a person received must have been equivalent to the cost of a CPI basket, that is like a basket of goods that the average person would have consumed, and the cost of that basket. So that was very innovative, and that's what they've used to calculate their wages. But what I want to show you is that there's a problem with that, right? There's a problem with that. And part of the problem, isn't really Jane and Jacob's fault. It's just a function of the fact that they're not medieval historians, right? And they don't have access, they don't read the medieval Latin manuscripts that historians spend their time reading. And there's a lot of things that get lost in translation, essentially. So this comes from one of Jane and Jacob's papers, and it looks at, they give an example of all the data points that they have, and they say they look at this dairymaid who earns 3 shillings plus a mixed livery and grains, right? But actually, we can go and look at the account itself, because this one happens to be published. You don't even need to learn the handwriting. You can go, and a little bit of Latin will get you through it. But all of a sudden, we uncover a range of problems, right? So first, this is saying it's in, well, it's supposed to say stipend days. This is a misprint. I don't know what it is. Stupendio, I suppose, is a wage you pay to an ineffective laborer. But in a state, right, in a stat, that basically means this is a wage only for summer. So it's not an annual wage like has been assumed. But more importantly is we can actually see the specific composition of the grains they were paid, right? Which means we don't actually have to use a proxy like a CPI basket to measure the value of their in-kind payment, because we know exactly what kind of grains and what quantities they were paid, right? So that's where we enter. We want to go in to the actual manuscripts, see what the in-kind payment looked like, and try to value that a bit more accurately, right? Because the CPI basket, this is the one that is most commonly used, created by Bob Allen. And it has its utility, right? Bob created these as a way to measure consumption and wages across time and space. But what it does is it's basically an average portfolio of consumption for a 500-year period, right? It's the same at the eve of the Industrial Revolution as it is for the Middle Ages. And that just simply isn't in line with what we know about consumption patterns historically, right? So in order to more accurately measure these wages, we need to circumvent this proxy of the CPI basket because it really, really distorts things. And basically, if you want to take this, reduce it to absurdity, just as kind of a thought exercise, the assumption implicit in using the CPI basket method is that any laborer that was paid in kind, partially in grain, is assumed that whatever the value of that was always equivalent to what was required for a respectable standard of living, right? It assumes that receiving payment in kind provided full assurance against price fluctuations, not only for grains, but all of the other items in this basket as well. So I can answer more on this in the questions, but basically, we think we can do better than this proxy of using a CPI basket, because the medieval accounts, like Alistair was showing here, and I'll show you another example here. This comes from a manor in Surrey owned by the Oxford College, Merton College, right? It tells us exactly who was working, how long they were working for, how much they were paid in cash, what grains they were paid. So it has everything we need to calculate the precise value for any of these laborers. So the methodology is actually very simple. It's just very, very time consuming. So this is just one example of a manorial account, and is telling us that a plowman and a shepherd who worked for the whole year, they have this weird way of expressing grain wages, but they basically said they had to work 9 weeks in order to earn a quarter of grain. And at the bottom in red, we have a boy, a Garciones, who's taking care of lambs, but he has to work 16 weeks to earn that same quantity of grain. So he's less well remunerated. So the main problem with the CPI methodology is that it assumes that everybody was paid in wheat bread. Well, this is a series of grain prices taken from 1250 to 1500, and there's two things I want to draw your attention to. The first thing is that the blue line is wheat. Wheat is the most expensive grain, right? So already the CPI basket methodology assumes that people were paid primarily with the most expensive grain, and that simply isn't the case, which I'll show you in a second. The more important thing is that there's this extreme volatility in annual grain prices, right? So there are times when being paid in grain might disadvantage an employer, or when grain prices go through the roof, as they did in the periods of famine in the 1320s and the Great Famine, and periodically throughout these 2 centuries. if an employer was required to provide their workers with a contractually stipulated quantity of grain, it's the employer's problem when that grain goes through the roof, right? We're in a cost of living crisis right now. We can really appreciate this. If our employers were providing us with bread and natural gas, we wouldn't really be worried about what the market price was, because it wouldn't affect us. If my employer was paying my mortgage for me, I wouldn't worry about climbing interest rates. But at other points, being paid in grain might actually advantage the employer and be a disadvantage for the employee, basically because there's more utility in cash than there is in grain, right? If I got paid in gift cards to my local grocery store, that doesn't give me the flexibility to spend the money as I might actually wish to. So depending on the prevailing price of grain prices, the kind of balance here of who was winning in this arrangement, employer or employee, could change. So I think there's some really interesting questions about labor relations to consider here. And these are just some, contemporary pictures from the 14th century of the kind of agricultural labors we capture, right? This is somebody harrowing, and this is a Garcione, small boy. They call him a rook herd. He's throwing rocks at rooks to keep them away from the newly seeded corn. These are people breaking up clods with hammers. This is one of the ways that agricultural labor could be intensified to prepare the soil a little bit better. These people are actually probably quite old and earning not very much. And this is a classic plowing scene, right? Plowing with oxen. The two people on the plow, the guy holding the plow is called a tentor. He's kind of the master of the plow. The guy with the big long whip is called a fugitor. He is less well paid than the main guy, and he's basically flogging the oxen. So where do we get if we apply our method and compare it with the kind of current methodology that uses the CPI basket? Well, this is where we started. I started off by showing you that dairy maid. So this is the first case we compared. And it was actually a bit deflating, right? Because we can work it all out here, what the difference is using the CPI basket versus what you get when you add all of the different grains together and take their prevailing price that year. And in the bottom row here, you see that we end up with a wage that is, 5.7% lower than what the CPI basket methodology gives you. And that actually is not such a big difference. So at that point, we're a little bit worried, like, okay, maybe this actually doesn't make a difference. But then we looked at a different case. This is a carter working at a manor called Piesenhall. And basically, when you look at the two different methodologies, well, we get a wage here that's 90% higher, right? And then we replicated this kind of individual level exercise over and over and over again. And basically, there are measurement errors in the CPI basket of this magnitude, across hundreds of laborers, across hundreds of years. So we get results that differ dramatically on the individual level, which kind of validated that our method was worth pursuing in more detail. So that is what we did. What I'm going to present with you here is kind of the first pilot study of proof of concept study. And what we wanted to do was try to see if we could get a long run series together that would show what our method did to the wage trends over this period of 1250 to 1450. Now, to do that, you have to find manors that have surviving accounts for really, really long runs. And there's no single manor that has accounts that survive for the full period of our study. But we did manage to find two to start with that together covered the full breadth of our study. So that's Esher. It's part of the bishopric of Winchester in the south of England. This is, kind of southwest London now. And Barnhorn, which was a Battle Abbey manor that's on the coast in Sussex. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the kind of heterogeneity of grain payments, right? These people are getting paid a range of different grains, and wheat does not feature primarily in any of them, right? Remember that the CPI basket assumes wheat is the main grain. Well, on these two manners, wheat is not significant at all, right? It's 0.4% at Barnhorn, 3% at Esher. There's other grains that are more frequently paid. So this is kind of, I've broken the cardinal rule of presenting time series data here by crunching this together. The x-axis is not continuous, right? If one of my students gave this to me, I'd be very, very unhappy. So this is like the ultimate do as I say and not as I do method, because any missing data, I've just taken it out so I could fit it onto one slide. But basically what it shows is all our data together and the composition of these grain payments. It can change over time as well. So, and with it changes the value. So the value when it was primarily barley at Esher is going to be different than when they switch in the kind of a third of the way through the 14th century to paying primarily in rye. And in the account, they basically say we're changing to rye because it's more cost effective for us. At Barnhorn, the method, the mixture is more stable, but overall, but the proportions will vary year on year quite significantly, and there's a lot more components to the mixture. So depending on what manner you're at, right, your wage will be different, depending on what kind of grain you're getting, which is another thing that the CPI basket method will miss, because it assumes everybody in medieval England is getting the same payment, and that simply is not the case. So just to kind of wrap up here, we run all of this through, and this is a kind of fingers crossed moment to see what does our method show when we aggregate all these together. And actually it shows some significant differences. So this is an average wage by decade. The dark black line is using our methodology, and the dotted line are the small dots are what Jane and Jacob have published. The long dashes are this what we call like a synthetic counterfactual. So what we do is we take our data and run it through this CPI method to see what would the CPI method give us if we use that methodology on our data. And what that does is just kind of controls for the different data samples that our respective studies will have. And the fact that the two dashed lines follow each other reasonably well basically shows us that our synthetic counterfactual is pretty accurate compared to what Humphreys and Weisdorf actually found. But basically, what we can see here is that our method produces wages that are significantly higher before the Black Death, and then seem to climb more quickly after the Black Death. And these are nominal wages, right? Just the raw wages that people were paid. What you might be thinking is, well, okay, prices were changing as well. So what does that mean in terms of a real wage, right? We need to kind of control for cost of living. So we do that here, deflating our nominal wages to control for standards of living, and basically this is the kind of shape we get when we use that wage. Humphreys and Weisdorf are kind of finding this stagnant low wage up until the Black Death, and then it climbs afterwards, which is the kind of traditional story, the golden age, right? The Black Death comes, half the population dies, feudalism gets broken, and wages climb, and it's the golden age for the laborer. And our story doesn't really turn that on its head, although our wages might climb a bit higher even, but we might actually have a slightly more Malthusian story here, because our wages are quite a bit higher in the 13th century. So it looks like, and this is very preliminary, if you use our methodology, the picture you get is that wages weren't climbing to unseen levels after the Black Death. They were simply returning to where they had been before. And perhaps the mounting pressure of a growing population on a limited amount of land before the Black Death, these decades before 1350, was driving wages and standards of living down. So this is our first preliminary conclusions. We're in the process of adding a lot more data, and I will end there and invite any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan, and spot on for timing as well. So well done on that. Thank you for introducing us to such a complex area, and it's really interesting to hear of your review of existing conclusions. Can I know I've certainly got a couple of questions, but can I invite questions from the floor first rather than abusing my position? So has anyone got their hand up? Karen, if you see anyone, can you let me know? Because I haven't got everyone on the same screen at the same time.
Francis had her hand up first, I think.
Francis.
Okay, Francis, thank you.
Okay, three really brief things. First of all, the leisure preference is very much a masculine construct. Feminist theorists who research in leisure have a huge issue with that because they say it was defined by men. It assumes a work-leisure dichotomy, which was not true for women, has never been true for women. And when women did have a concept of leisure, it was a different concept of leisure. So that's just that background, that there is a whole lot of feminist theory on the history of leisure. The second thing is the Black Death. I mean, the other thing, of course, is don't forget the obvious, that after the Black Death, a whole lot of people had died, and therefore with a labour shortage, certain jobs are in demand and people can demand a higher wage. But the third thing is, I think that there's another way to look at wages. I mean, there are two things. There are how were people paid, and there's how much were people paid. And another way to look at how much they were paid, I think, is to use another proxy. And that proxy is to go to merchant accounts and to look at what people spent. Because in a time when people spent most of what they earned, by looking at merchant accounts, which are often quite detailed, even in that period, you can get a pretty good idea of how much money people had. Now, admittedly, that's going to exclude part of society. For instance, a lot of people relied on alms, and there were things that weren't done at all through the cash economy, but it might just give you another handle in as you get into this area even more. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much. Yeah, quickly, I completely take your point about the gender component of this. We make no claims about the leisure preference ourselves. That was simply kind of an indicative graph to give some context about why people care about wages. We are looking at this, especially after the Black Death, because, I mean, as you say, there's a lot of things that women do that don't, get measured in the labor market the same way that male work does. But basically, the golden age of the laborer does not seem to have been very golden for women, for example, right? So male wages tend to rise after the Black Death. Female wages do not. One of the things we're actually looking at is the ability of the state to control wages. So this legislature comes in after the Black Death, the Ordinance of Laborers, the Statute of Laborers, and what it does is to try to legislate ceilings on wages back to the pre-Black Death level. You may not pay a laborer more than you paid them before the plague to stop inflation, essentially. And of course, the legislators, the members of parliament at the time were these great landowners themselves, so they have a vested interest. But basically what we have found some anecdotal evidence that female wages were suppressed by this legislation more than male wages. So yeah, I take your point on that. And yeah, absolutely, we need to kind of look a little bit at what the consumption patterns were and how that relates to the wages we're capturing in our work, which are actually a pretty narrow portfolio of agricultural laborers. It still is probably a significant proportion of society, but it isn't telling us what people could earn with their own land, and it isn't telling us what they were buying necessarily. Merchants' accounts would be a good idea. We also have household accounts that will tell us a little bit about what slightly wealthier people were buying. So thanks for your comments.
Very interesting indeed, Jordan. Just a couple of thoughts, mainly out of ignorance. One would be that from what I remember from Roman history and most other history, cities always do better than the countryside because the political interests dominate in the cities, and they make sure that the food gets to the city mobs by extracting it from the countryside. So how significant is the growth of cities during this period? And the other one would be, I've been doing work with Dubin Ma, who was at LSE, now at Oxford, on Chinese accounts. And I know he's done a lot of stuff on what wages and living standards were in China because of this great debate about when was the divergence between the West and the East. So it might be interesting to see whether the methods that the historians looking at China are using stand up in the light of your critique of how to measure real wages.
Yeah, thank you. Well, say hi to Devin, first of all. We miss him in London. So our evidence is exclusively rural, basically. We do have some manors that were, on the hinterland of London, but these are agricultural laborers. So we don't really capture with this evidence what was going on in cities. So urbanization is definitely a phenomenon in the 13th and 14th centuries. London in particular is growing quite quickly. And there are people who have worked on, so the guild records would probably have an idea about wage growth in urban manufacturing. We could look at construction accounts that still exist for places like Westminster Abbey. That would tell you a little bit about what urban craftsmen in the construction industry were doing. And I think those are all, once we get, all of our data in and stuff, and we get a kind of more definitive picture of what was going on in the countryside, it will definitely be worthwhile to see how that maps on to the situation in more urban centers. And similarly, for China. I mean, what we're basically trying to do here is come up with what we think is a really historically accurate, measure of wages that allows us to measure the underlying trends, but also the variance between over time and space, right? So do wages grow more quickly in the manors near London or the areas that are more integrated into markets? We're less interested at this point, or less able really to draw conclusions on a global scale, but we hope to get there eventually.
Good. I've got one more, if I may. Going back to the beginning, and Edward I, a friend in Aberystwyth here has now got a grant from the Institute of Chartered Accountants to look at the accounts of Edward I for building the castles in Wales. So enormous resources. I mean, in modern day terms, Aberystwyth Castle would have cost £50 million or something. But it's complete. They've got all the wage records and everything for all the people who the king brought in to do the work.
Yeah, I have those accounts as well, actually, and they're actually really, really fascinating. And to go back to the comment about gender dynamics, it's very interesting because you start to see gender wage discrimination in those accounts. So women being paid 2/3 less for the same job as men. Let's say carting stones back and forth at a castle building site. Where the wheelbarrow had been invented, and probably there's probably no strength premium for men when you're using a wheelbarrow, but so it's a tremendous resource, these castle building accounts, and we actually plan to use them as a comparative series as well in our long run plan.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to interrupt there, just so that we can start the next session on time. But thank you very much indeed for that, Jordan, and thank you for the questions. There will be chance at the end. Some of us will be hanging around for a little bit more discussion. But can we just show our appreciation to Jordan? You can see people clapping even if you can't hear them, Jordan. Anyway, thank you very much. Right, Catherine. Introduce Catherine Casson from University of Manchester to you, who's going to be speaking about urban rents and the property market. Catherine has a very interesting background. You were formerly at the Winston Institute for Monetary History, Catherine, at the University of Oxford, Ashmolean. So you've got some usefully different perspectives to offer to our audience today. So over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Right, thanks. So in keeping with some of the questions just now, I'm moving into the urban sphere a bit. And what I'm going to do is kind of give you a bit of an outline of the types of sources we used for this, because I wasn't sure how familiar people would be, and then show how my colleague and I have applied them to a case study from Cambridge. So basically, medieval urban history is an area that has received surprisingly little attention for statistical analysis. So there has been a lot done in the work of people like Beckett and Alfreton and Turner, looking at how property prices and rents varied in the early medieval and modern periods, and also by Greg Clark, who Jordan mentioned. But the focus has tended to be in their work on agricultural land. In the Middle Ages, or the medieval data, there's been mainly a focus on the evidence on urban topography from the disciplines of archaeology and geography. So this gives a gap really that can be used to think about what we can learn about economic history from the surviving sources. So what we're trying to do here is kind of fill in a chronological gap in the debate that has used economic methods by adding in the Middle Ages, shifting the focus to urban property rather than what's been mainly on rural, and perhaps significantly using the statistical techniques applied to early modern rural and urban rents to medieval rents. So like I said, I'm going to just briefly outline the type of sources we have available for this, and then focus on one of these sources in detail, which is on Cambridge. And this is interesting for both the statistical information it provides, but also for the qualitative evidence it provides on entrepreneurship as well. And I thought I'd just show you a flavour of that as well. So what is our research question then? Well, this paper is part of a kind of wider project that's been undertaken on the urban property market. And the key question for that was basically, what is the relationship between the operation of the property market and the commercial revolution of the 13th century? So do we see a sort of property boom and investment in this area, which again has received less attention from others? We were also interested in, although less for this project, in what information can the operation of the property market shed on urban topography and occupational structures? Who acquired property and how did they acquire it, and how were capital gains realised and how were they spent? So I won't have time to touch on all of these issues in 20 minutes, but as I said, I'm showing you a case study, one of several that we've done, and we've also covered a number of other towns. And just to give you a flavour of the sources, this is an image of one of the primary sources in Gloucester, which is a rent roll that basically creates a map of the city, and the pictures here are landmarks to help the rent collector navigate around. One second. Oh, sorry, my slide. Ah, there we go. So it's useful just to give a little bit of context on how the medieval property market operated legally, in order to kind of understand the similarities and also the differences to today. So basically, the foundation of the property market was the laying out of burgage plots in new or expanding towns by local landowners, known as lords, who were acting with the consent of the king. And we can often see in places like Wallingford, near where I'm from, the lines of these burgage plots still in the city topography today. You may live near places that have them. A burgage acquired a plot by paying a perpetual rent to the landowner, and this was called Horgabble in Cambridge, and erecting a building conforming to a local plan. And the burgess had the right to bequeath or sell that plot. A similarity today is that property could be traded, but there are different ways in which you could take your capital gains. One was as a lump sum payment in the way that we're perhaps familiar with today, but the other one was in an additional perpetual rent, in which the buyer would basically carry on paying something to the seller, almost a little bit like we might be familiar with a mortgage today. So rather than getting all the money at once from the transaction, you're receiving a constant kind of set sum over time. Another kind of difference was that rent was attached to the property rather than to the owner. So if a property was sold, the new owner had to pay the Horgabble rent and had to continue paying any rent due to previous owners. So this could kind of add up to quite a bit over time. Rent itself could be traded. So you can also, that's a separate thing to trading the property. And rent recipients could also bequeath and sell their rent, for example, to a religious institution. So basically, the summary of all of this is that what we see is that many properties in Cambridge carried multiple rents. And this is usually because they have been bought or sold several times, and a new capital gain was therefore added on each occasion. And basically, it was responsibility of the property's owner to ensure that those payments were made correctly. We don't know entirely why the system developed, but it's possible that it may have been connected to a shortage of currency at the time, and also the absence of a kind of banking framework that would provide loans. So today we're looking at one type of source, but it's useful just to be aware that we do have a lot of information on this topic if people wanted to follow it up in their own research. So some of the earliest evidence we have on the property market comes from Anglo-Saxon charters, and these effectively are title deeds for land, properties and rights. And we can use those to learn about topics like the foundation of monasteries, and also the role, as Alistair has indicated, of the church as important landowners and landlords. Obviously, the Domesday Book, most people are familiar with. This covers the situation during the reign of Edward the Confessor, and as well as after Norman Conquest, and can provide context on the chronology of urbanisation, agricultural organisation, and social and legal relationships. Another record that's been used by historians are feet of fines, and these are basically ways of recording property transactions that were intended to avoid disputes in the future. They can inform on topics including changes in the use in agricultural land, changes in the value of property, and interest rates. And they've notably been used by Margaret Yates and Bruce Campbell, whose work you may be familiar with. Another source of evidence is deeds. And again, just to briefly summarise, these are effectively transfers of property that are recorded in the borough court. So in the case of Coventry, for example, that we've looked at, this is one of the main sources of evidence. They're interesting in that they can inform on interest rates, urban topography, because they often provide detailed descriptions of the location of the property, so you can cross-reference different deeds and build up a town street plan. And they also can be used to inform on property values and their characteristics such as location. The source that I'm going to focus on today is the 100 rolls, and I'll explain about that in a couple of minutes. But this is basically considered to be the second Domesday in the intended scope of analysis, the way it was conducted, and the sort of format of it. And then finally, another source that we particularly use for other towns, this is urban rentals of the sort I showed you the image of from Gloucester. And these were usually created, as sort of again Alistair has indicated, by institutions or wealthy private landowners who were monitoring their property portfolio. And again, this can give us a good picture of the situation after Doomsday, and it can be used for statistical analysis. So basically, one of the things that's put people off studying the property market is that not all towns have these records available for them, and some towns have one type of record but not the others. So you're dealing with quite a range of sources in this kind of broader area. Oops, sorry, I seem to have skipped a slide. There we go. So the source I'm going to focus on today then is the 100 Rolls, which is known as the Second Doomsday. And like Doomsday, this was instigated by the king, probably in an attempt to establish the extent to which the rights of the crown had been eroded by gifts of to various religious institutions of the sort seen in Anglo-Saxon charters, who were then paying tax to the Pope instead of rents to the king. And Henry III, father of Edward I, who commissioned the survey, had been very generous towards the church. And so when his son became monarch, he was quite worried about the implications of this for royal finance. It seems like Doomsday, this was intended to cover all of England. But in fact, rolls only survive for some counties, and others seem never to have been surveyed at all. So Cambridge is in one of about 5 counties for which records survive, and it has one of the most detailed entries. So the information was collected under the supervision of royal officials by a jury of townspeople. And basically they appear to have been asked a number of questions about the different plots in the town and both their situation in 1279, but also importantly, their history going back to circa 1200. So we have both a snapshot, but also a kind of 80-year history on all of these 1,088 plots that were surveyed. So the rolls cover Cambridge and its Belmar suburb, and for each of these over 1,000 properties, we have information on the names of the owners, how the plot was used, its location at the parish level, any rents attached to it and their levels. We have the history of plots up to 7 generations of ownership, and this has been able to use to help create some of the information about family dynasties of speculators. We have the way in which transmission between different groups occurred, whether that was by inheritance, gift, marriage, or purchase, some indication of how different parties were related to each other, and again, the different rents reported on each plot with the names of the recipients. So before I give you an illustration of that, it's just helpful to kind of remind ourselves of what Cambridge was like at this period. So in 1279, Cambridge is experiencing both the commercial and service sector benefits of the commercial revolution. It's a key regional hub for the grain trade, and it's also an administrative centre for the locality and for the Bishop of Ely. But we are primarily looking at the period before the establishment of the university. So you might be familiar today with the round church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre shown at the top there. Also on the left, we see what's known as the School of Pythagoras, in the grounds of St. John's College, which still survives. And then slightly out of the city centre, we have 2 elements of religious institutions. We have the Cellars Chequer, which is part of Balmoral Priory, and the Leper Chapel of St. Mary Magdalene. So when we're thinking about our results, for those of you familiar with Cambridge, these can help us kind of think about the comparison between what we're talking about then and now. So given the nature of evidence, it's useful just to give you an indication of a kind of typical entry in the 100 Rolls. And again, I've shown some pictures behind it of the kind of original form of the document. So this entry relates to a messuage, which is the most common form of property, and it provides quite a full account of the descent of the ownership. So we see that Thomas Goodman holds 1 messuage in the parish of St. Peter's at the Castle, that's location, which he acquired by gift of Michael Parley, which the same Michael acquired by purchase from Dennis, son of William Eversland, and the same Dennis acquired by inheritance through the death of his father William, and the same William acquired by inheritance through the death of Elena Amp, and in respect whereof he pays per annum to the said Michael and his heirs 1 rose, and to Margaret, widow of Ralph Tapmaker and her heirs 1/2 mark, and to the heir of Robert Seaman 1 pound of pepper, and to the bailiffs of Cambridge who hold the said town in fee farm, etc., in Horgable 2.5 pence. So basically a messuage is a plot of land with a residential building on it. And we see here the history of the plot, and we can note that 4 separate rents were paid. 1 was a substantial money rent of 1/2 mark, 1 was a small money rent of Horgable, One was a reasonably valuable payment in kind of £1 of pepper, and one was a token payment in kind of a rose. And the payment of the rose to Michael and his heirs corresponds with the description of the transaction as a gift for Michael, although it's possible there was also some payment of a lump sum as well. Those aren't actually recorded in the rolls, those lump sum payments, but we know from deeds they were quite common. The Horgabble is quite low for this, but actually relative to the norm of the town, it's quite high, as the norm is a penny or half a penny. So that's one of the kind of many entries. But if we take the total kind of body of evidence of over 1,000 plots, what can we learn about, first of all, the types of property in Cambridge? Well, basically, for statistical analysis, we need a certain number of entries in each thing to be able to do that. So in some cases, we had to amalgamate the categories. So what that means is we're left with 7 types of urban property and 2 types of land. And properties of missing information had to be given their own category. So basically what we can see from just the types of property is the messuages are the most numerous, while land in the Cambridge fields is the predominant form of agricultural land. So we can now move on just to do some descriptive statistics on location of the property. So as I said, in Cambridge, we only have evidence at the parish level. In some other towns, we have evidence for the street. It varies according to the nature of the source. So most of these are parishes. The only non-parish locations are the communities of Barnwell, Newnham and Howells, together with the marketplace. And basically, for statistical analysis, all of these parishes have a viable number of entries. The largest, I think, is St Mary's with 76, and the smallest is St Sepulchre. So again, before we look at the regressions, we can also think about the types of owner. So what we see from this table is that although men dominated property ownership, women are well represented too. Just under 75% of entries relate to properties held only by men. About 13.6% are held only by women, and 10.5% by men and women jointly, mainly as husbands and wives. Only a very small, just over 1% of properties are held from institutions, sorry, are held by institutions. Most properties that appear in the individual entries are actually held from institutions. So basically, institutions appear mainly not as holders of property paying perpetual rents, but actually, as we'll see, as recipients of rents. Sorry, the Zoom bars are cutting off some of my ability to see the slides, so I'll just move around slightly. Oh, that's better. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry. So now we move on to thinking about the regression analysis. So basically what we did was we undertook regression analysis on this to see what factors determined variation in rent levels. And basically the most striking result was that most of the variation in rent levels was explained by property characteristics and by location. So thinking of property characteristics, messuages carried a premium, shops, interestingly, were worth less than messuages, and stalls, which are generally sort of temporary places in the marketplace, were worth less than shop. The nature of the land holding had fairly little impact on levels of rent. People who were leasing paid on average higher rents than ordinary holders of property, but not significantly so. People who purchased their properties paid slightly higher rents than people who acquired their properties in other ways, like inheritance or gift, but again, not significantly so. Properties acquired from family members, where you might expect to see a bit of a degree of favouritism that resulted in a cheaper rent, paid again slightly lower rents than others, but not really significantly so. So the nature of the transaction doesn't really appear to be very related to property rent levels. When we're thinking about variations in rent, however, the results are very striking. And what we see is 3 property hotspots all within the centre. And again, I kept the landmarks on this map just to give you an idea of where they're positioned in relation to modern Cambridge. So the main property hotspot with the area of high rent is around the church of St Sepulchre, in the parish of St Sepulchre and in St Clement's. and it's particularly associated with the junction of the High Street, which was St John Street, and Conduit Street, now Sydney Street. There's also an area of high rents in St Mary's, and interestingly, the area around the parish of St Mary's carries higher rents than in the markets itself. And the premium in St Mary's seems to be accounted for by the fact that there are residential properties that are close to the church, but far enough from the market to avoid the noise, smell and nuisance of that. And there's a third, much smaller centre of of high rents, property hotspot, near the parish of St Peter at the castle. It's possible that at one point this was a major trading centre, but by 1279 it had become largely a residential area. And it seems possible that this is where sort of widows or widowers went to retire, having maybe passed on the key properties that the family had to sons and daughters. In contrast, there are no significant results for land in the Cambridge and Barmar fields, and this suggests that rents had little relationship to the amounts of land involved. So those are three areas of high rent, the property hotspots, but there were also areas of cheaper rent, and these were particularly in the suburbs. So St Peter outside Trumpington Gate, where there's basically an 11 pence discount on rents, All Saints at the Castle, which is kind of over the other side of the river beyond the property hotspot, and St Michael's. And the suburban locations of Barnwell and Newnham are particularly cheap, where you get significant discounts on your rent for moving there. So this supports the view that peripheral locations were cheaper than central ones. All Saints at the Castle is the most northerly parish, St Michael's is a westerly parish, and St Peter's, Barnwell and Newnham all lay on the southern or eastern edges of the town. So again, this is a feature that we kind of expect to see with the modern property market, but we're seeing in medieval Cambridge. And this idea of city centre property hotspots is something we found in a number of the other towns we've looked at, notably Gloucester, Hull and Bristol. Although interestingly in Bristol, the hotspot shifts between the city centre and the suburbs. As one gets kind of more crowded, people move out. As that gets more crowded, people move back in again. Oops, Okay, so I've given you a little bit idea about the quantitative information to Cambridge, but I just wanted to spend the last few minutes giving an idea of some of the light this sheds on entrepreneurship. Because as I said, one of the features of 100 Rolls is the information that we can get on the histories of ownership. And we can cross-reference this as well with other sources to try and find out more about these families who were involved in Cambridge's economy. And what we see is there's evidence surviving of 36 family dynasties, and these can be quite clearly divided into old wealth and new wealth. And I'm just going to show an example of each here. So the Dunnings were the family that lived in the school of Pythagoras that is now in the grounds of St John's College. And they're an example of old wealth who were kind of had their roots in a warrior aristocracy. Many of these people had acquired lands probably through royal service or through fighting, and some of them also held lands elsewhere in the county. The Dunning family in particular seem to have had land in Cambridge from as early as the Norman conquest, and are living in this lovely house by circa 1200, when Harvey Dunning is the main kind of protagonist. So Harvey, who you can see here on the family tree, he inherited a lot of land from his family members, but he also sold a lot to finance his lifestyle. And in particular, he quickly became indebted to members of the local Jewish community. And living beyond their means seems to have really been a characteristic of the Dunning family. But despite his debts, Harvey was very philanthropic. He supported local religious houses, giving land to Barnwell Priory in 1199, given 7 acres of land to the Hospital of St John, and also given houses and lands to St Madigan's, where his sister was a nun. So Harvey was kind of, given away quite a lot of his wealth. But despite that, he was able to leave some property to his children. His nephew Leon, who we see further down here, benefited from inheriting some family property, but unfortunately, again, followed the tradition of depleting the resources further. Leon was a volatile character. He sided with the barons in the baronial revolt of 1264-7, although he received a pardon in 1268. He was accused of maintaining his own court in Newnham, and also at one point rebelled by refusing to pay Hall-gobble due on his properties to the bailiffs of Cambridge. Leon and the other grandchildren and children of Harvey and his brother Adam unfortunately appeared to have run up further debts with Cambridge's Jewish community. And to service those debts, they continued depleting the family's portfolio by selling off more and more property or seeing it seized because they'd used it as a liability. As a result, shortly after the 100 Rolls in the late 13th and early 14th century, they'd entirely depleted their estates and actually left Cambridge altogether. And a real irony of this is that much of their property was actually purchased by Walter de Merton, founder of Merton College, Oxford, and was used for its endowment. So the Dunnings really are attempting just to live off wealth accumulated by several generations. They're not really attempting to seek other forms of income, and they're living beyond their means by supporting too many people from their rents and giving away too much to religious institutions. In contrast, the new wealth in Cambridge was more proactive. These were people who had careers in salary positions in the service sector, or who appeared to have made their money through the grain trade and work as merchants in the agricultural and urban economy. So Walter M is an example of one of these new wealth. Walter M is a self-made man. We know very little about him other than that his father was called Robert. And it seems unlikely that he inherited much from Robert. But as an entrepreneur in his own right, Walter quickly builds up a substantial property portfolio. So Walter appears to be an only child and possibly from a long line of only children. And the 100 Rolls document that he purchased 17 properties during his lifetime. And it seems these purchases were financed out of the profits of the grain trade. His main properties were centrally located near the river. So he has messuages in St John's Parish, and he also holds vacant land in St Botolph's and in Cambridge Field. These properties are all bought from different people, and some of them seem to have been bought from older families who were struggling, like the Dunnings, and having to sell off their assets. So we know that Walter only inherited 2 properties from his father, so to build this up to over 17 is quite impressive. Unfortunately for Walter, though, he was unable to create a lasting dynasty. He was survived only by his daughter Margaret, who marries into the Seaman family. And the Seaman family, like the Dunnings, are one of the older families of Cambridge. So rather ironically, a bit like the situation with American heiresses back in the later in the 19th century, Walter's property portfolio from his entrepreneurship goes to prop up the failing fortunes of one of the older dynasties. And this is not the only example where this happens. So I appreciate that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through a kind of large body of evidence, but just to give some conclusions that we've derived from the whole database of properties and the whole database of families. What we can see, first of all, is that property transactions are important. Property is perceived as an asset that was bought and sold in a fairly similar way to what we know today. We've seen that despite a relative lack of attention on the topic, there's a wide range of sources available to study the property markets in English medieval towns. We've seen that we can actually build up a picture of who the people are and how some of them are facing declining fortunes and some of them are really experiencing entrepreneurship. And we've seen that property hotspots were present just as they were today, and just as today, property is a tradable asset. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. That was absolutely fascinating. And again, it shows there are so many possibilities to pursue from the records, which you very usefully to us, that was a very useful overview of the sources available, but there's so much that can be done with those. Catherine, could I ask you just to stop screen sharing? Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. And I'll put so you can see me now. So thank you very much. And could I invite any questions, please? And Simon Morris, you've appeared up. If you'd like to unmute yourself. and then Richard.
I was just actually, rather than putting up a request for a question, I was just clapping my hands to congratulate Catherine.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. Richard, can I move on to you, please?
Thanks. One personal bias. Do we have similar records for Oxford?
Not to the extent you think. No, Oxford was somewhere that I looked at about 5 years ago, and there basically the situation in Oxford is that the colleges obviously mainly owned things outside of Oxford, so they have a lot of records, but not so much about the town itself. Salter did some work on Oxford as well, but unfortunately the detail isn't really enough to do anything with. The entries sometimes just give a bit of information about what the rent was, but not really much on where the property was or who owned it. So, and it's quite patchy in terms of when there are full years, the number of entries is quite low for statistical analysis, and there aren't many runs of years. So yeah, there is some there, but it's unfortunately not very good for the sort of questions that we're basically seeking to ask. But Salters would be the main work to look at if you're interested.
Right. Another your main first conclusion that property is a tradable asset in the city, but is it so in the I mean, I'm just thinking here in Aberystwyth, there's a little bit in the centre of town where all the local landlords in the country had their townhouse, but they wouldn't have ever sold the land that's out in the country. That would be just passed on by inheritance from generation to generation. It's only the city properties that are tradable.
Well, there's some tradable. I think Margaret Yates has looked a bit more about this. I mean, sometimes in the countryside you see it's generally revealed in the feats of fines where it may be, for example, obviously through marriage or through inheritance. Some families end up with property in quite like random places. So if your family heart is, say, Gloucester, where we have a lot of these people who have these townhouses and country lands, and maybe you marry someone who's ended up with a bit of land, I don't know, near Aberystwyth, and it's only like a tiny amount, you may decide to sell it in order to try and buy something nearer Gloucester, a bit like the monasteries do. So I think when it's a choice between having maybe a consolidated portfolio or having maybe, for example, you've got land in one area and don't think it's such good quality land and you're in a position to maybe trade it, I think it sort of happens. It can happen in those cases.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, I'm just skimming through my screen. Any other questions at the moment? While people are thinking, Catherine, can I just ask, that lovely rental for Gloucester, was that produced by Gloucester Abbey or Gloucester town? Or
almost, it's a collaboration. It's collaboration where it's basically during the period of recession, and so both the town and the abbey has this big portfolio of effectively what we now consider kind of student housing in the suburbs, sort of fairly low quality, low rent housing, and it hasn't really bothered monitoring it very well because it was just raking in the money. And then come the recession, people are leaving Gloucester and suddenly they're not getting the money in. Meanwhile, the bailiffs, if you like, have been kind of letting the rent collection for the land gabble slip a bit for the same reason. It was all fine. And suddenly they're facing a problem of meeting their annual commitment to the king called the farm. So both of them are like, we need to kind of get ourselves sorted. So Robert Cole, who's one of the canons who monitors Lanton's property portfolio, is called in to do the survey for the town civic authorities of what they need. So he basically covers most of the central area, and he wants obligation to pay. So he's basically going around saying, this property, we know you owe us money and we're putting this down in writing. So, next year when we go around, we make sure you pay up and you don't sort of forget. So yes, it's a collaboration between the two. So it's unusually attractive, but the idea is it's supposed to be a map. So those aren't just decorative features, those are ways that someone, when, Cole is no longer there, can still follow round and track down the property. So it's supposed to be very, an administrative document.
Yeah, it was beautifully presented as well, and with those illustrations. But as you say, they're useful. Just a further question: the 100 rolls, because then you get the statute of Mortmain, don't you, where the king says, you can't carry on giving land to the church without license. What did the 100 rolls throw up? Did they make it very clear how much income had been lost to the king by all these gifts to the church? Or
Yeah,
you said it was only done in 5 counties.
It seems that there's probably certainly what it reveals is how much, in Cambridge, over 50% of rents are going to the local religious institutions and hospitals. So that's quite a substantial amount. So I think, Sandra Rabban's done a lot of work, particularly on, as you probably know, on the statute of Mortmain. I suspect there does appear to be a connection that sort of these are, people's maybe philanthropy is meaning that things are going out rather than perhaps being reinvested. So yeah, it's difficult to be absolutely known for sure, but it does seem it's quite likely that there's a connection between the two, and that's one of the big worries.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to skim through and see any other thoughts.
I think I've seen one hand up, I think.
Oh yes, yeah. Sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this. Kuchok. Probably. Would you like to unmute?
Yes, thank you very much. The presentation is really quite interesting, and also now we are going to run short of time, in which we are not going to get more detail. Now, my questions, I have 2 concerns that I wanted to understand better. So, according to presenter, I've seen something written like a rent can be rented, something like that. Yes. So I wanted actually to understand how is that one possible? That's one. Then number 2, also I've seen something like the mode of ownership to own a property. So it can be either through gift, marriage, and so forth. But I wanted to understand the procedures used, like to own a property via gift or marriage. Thank you very much.
With the first one, with rent being traded, because obviously one of the things you could do was kind of attach a rent to a property and get it every year. So say, for example, I'm in the process of moving house in Manchester, and say I could, for example, have tried to attach a rent to my property on Beach Road, and then move to Birchwood Avenue and still be wanting the new resident of Beach Road to be paying me a kind of annual amount of money rather than a big lump. And it might be at some point I actually wanted to sell on that obligation. So I say for £10, a lump sum, I will sell to you that ability to receive this kind of rent of every kind of 10 years. It's a bit like almost maybe it's a little bit like perhaps you might do something with like a parking space today or something. So it's something we don't have so much, but that would be the idea, is eventually I could then sell that as a lump sum and say, you pay me this, I'll then get back, and you'll then, not me, receive this kind of 10 shillings a year or something. On the other one, with the mode of transition, traditionally people have often, so obviously inheritance would be passing on death to your heirs, which may be son or daughter, but may also be nephew, niece, etc. Gifting is sometimes what's done. What you often see with gifting is it may be parents who are perhaps effectively downsizing, or who may be moving into a monastery that's almost like a hospital, are gifting the property for the children. And that may be a genuine gift, or it may be a situation where perhaps they have 3 children and only one of them kind of wants it. So there's actually a bit like today, again, you might buy your siblings out of the house. So, your parents no longer need the house. There's 3 of you. One of them wants to live there. They buy the other's house. One of them might give some money in exchange to kind of be shared amongst the others. So there's a sort of gift with no strings attached and gift with strings attached. And then there's, if you like, the sale, which is the kind of outright transaction. So we just broke them down a little bit, because there is some theories that might say, gifting it's cheaper, or inheritance it's cheaper because it takes into account the family relations, whereas in fact there's very little difference in rent levels between those types. So I'll wrap up there because I know we're kind of overrunning a bit.
Okay,
That's
thank
quite
you very much,
interesting.
Catherine.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on something there. And then now, in the current accounting setting in London, do we have such scenarios that is happening?
Well, I'd be hard pushed to say about so much about in London today, but I mean, certainly some of the things we've seen, like we've seen spatial autocorrelation in some of the towns we've looked at in Hull, which is a feature of the modern property market where adjacent properties have similar values. So, I mean, I wouldn't like to say fully on the legal context because there certainly are similarities, but there are differences. But with the property values, definitely we've seen cases that are, we can say, you know, modern times have spatial autocorrelation, medieval times had that.
Okay, thank you so much indeed, Catherine. I'd better stop the questions there in case some people have to go. But if we could just show our appreciation to Catherine, thank you very much indeed. And just to wrap up, I'd like to thank both Catherine and Jordan very, very much indeed for joining us today. You've really broadened the sort of the pool that we draw upon in terms of coming from different disciplines of economic history and enterprise. So we do appreciate that very much. We will be hanging around. I can't remember how long we have on this link, but we do hang around for a little while of informal discussion if you are available for that. Karen, I think we should probably mention the next workshop is scheduled for the, have I got it right, that's Tuesday the 14th of February.
Yes, that's right. So we have our next workshop Tuesday the 14th of February, same time. The theme is digital archives. And then if you really want to get in advance, we're going to have another one on the 14th of March, and the theme will be colonialisation. So you can pop those into your diaries, 14th of both months. And as Alistair said, thank you so much to Catherine and Jordan, and thank you to Alistair as well. And you're all welcome to hang around and chat if you want to, but if you've got places to go, obviously, you need to go. Okay, thank you very much. See you next month.
Thanks, Karen and Alistair.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Catherine and Jordan again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting Alistair. It was great.
Good. No, thank you, Jordan. I look forward to having a chat some other time as well with you on your work.
Yeah, well, we'll have to catch up at some point soon. Now that I'm back on this side of the world.
Yeah, because one of the things I was wondering about your work is that it's given transport costs, grain prices can just vary so hugely in different regions of the country, and I'm just thinking about that, the influence of that on the sort of grain prices that you use for calculating your averages.
Yeah, well, it's something we're puzzling over right now, actually. I mean, it's great. Transport costs are one thing, and I mean, market integration is another. So, you know, in parts of the world like London and East Anglia, where there's a lot of markets, you might expect prices to be lower, basically, than, you know, more remote places. There are published grain price series, like David Farmer has one, is primarily Southern England. And so he'll have an average price that at least takes, you know, half of the country into account. So we can use that. And we're at least going to compare them. The other kind of confounding issue is how you actually think about the value of a payment in grain. And it depends on the value you ascribe to. It depends on what you think the person was going to do with it. So, you know, if they're going to consume the grain, then in some ways, like the cash value is a secondary concern. If they were going to sell the grain in order to buy other things, then it's a very real concern. And you have to ask, you know, if you use the local price, is that the most accurate valuation of a grain? Because it, you know, kind of assumes then that the person who received it would sell it in the same region as well. So I mean, there's lots of things we kind of have to still think through in this, but and endless comparison of spreadsheets, basically.
Yeah, and even, you know, when you think of grain, because, you know, you make the distinction between wheat and other forms, but I just wonder how homogeneous was grain in those days in, say, for example, the calorific content of an ear of wheat or something that was grown in Durham compared to one that was grown somewhere else. I just wonder how, because you do get manors where they make a deliberate effort to get their seed from somewhere else each year.
Yeah. I mean, that is something that we probably won't be able to know. I mean, you might be able to do it somehow qualitatively, but I mean, it's a good question. It's a good question. If I mean, there must be food science people who look at the quality of a given quantity of grain in terms of its calorific content. That I should yet another rabbit hole to disappear down.
Well, unfortunately, yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing for me is that is the heterogeneity of the grains that were paid, and it's a question of whether these employees demanded to be paid in grain because they wanted to be insulated from price fluctuations, or if they were forced to accept grain as payment. So at Barnhorn, people were paid in oats, which is the cheapest grain, and might even be like, there might be some indignity to it if you're essentially getting paid in horse feed. But if you have animals, it probably has some utility. And then I presented this in California, and somebody was saying, oh, well, oats will have the highest calorie content. But we think of oats as these rolled oats that we make porridge with now. But I mean, I don't think they were in the Middle Ages, and whether they could. So the calorie extraction from a grain is another consideration, right? So if you get, barley and you brew with it, which people would have done, you're only getting 30% of the calories. Whereas if you got a grain and you made some kind of disgusting porridge, which they tend to do, it's the best way to get the calories out of it, if not the most delicious. So, yeah, I mean, there's too many variables to keep track of some days.
Yeah, you just reminded me there of that entry in the first Encyclopedia Britannica under oats, which was something like a cereal eaten by horses and Scotsmen.
yeah, exactly.
Sounds like you share the abhorrence of it. Yes, yeah.